Good morning. It's delightful to be with you. This is our Sunday morning Bible study. And even though we cannot be together in person for these studies, we are together through the medium of technology. And we encourage you to join with us. Get your Bible. We'll be looking at a lot of verses this morning. Get you the outline from our website. And if you haven't gotten a chance to get that, just put this on pause for a moment and download that. Get you a pen and get you a comfortable chair, and let's sit together and talk about some things. This is a study of the book of Daniel. And what we have done so far this year is we've looked at several of the big prophets. We've had a study of Isaiah. We've had a study of Ezekiel. Now we're doing a study of Daniel. And when we think about the prophetic books in our Bible, whether we talk about the books of the first 5 books, the major prophets, or the 12 minor prophets, we see that they're really divided by size and not importance or not of messianic messages. And when we think about the 5 major prophets, Daniel is the smallest, and Daniel is the one that probably we know the most about. I mean, how many of us have grown up with stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in that fiery furnace? Or how many VBSs we have sat through where we talked about Daniel in the lion's den. As our faith has grown, we've talked about the hand that appeared in chapter 5, writing those words on the wall. Or we've read about the kingdom of God as it was prophesied in Daniel chapter 2. Lots of lessons, lots of sermons, lots of information coming out of the book of Daniel. And so this study will take us through the book of Daniel. And we hope that you'll stay with us through this. The value of having these things videotaped is that you can go back through it again. Or if you skip one, it's not lost because you can go back and see it again. And that's some of the things that we're going to be looking at. Daniel's a great book. It's a powerful book. And what we're going to see as we kind of today just do the introduction, just kind of look at some of the backgrounds to the book of Daniel, what we're going to find is really Daniel is 2 books in one. The first 6 chapters are historical. That's the stuff you and I know. That's the lessons of faith and prayer and fiery furnaces and lions' dens and great courage. Chapter 7 through 12 are visions, and that's the stuff we don't know. And that's the parts of Daniel that's difficult. And so we're going to put this together and just kind of go through the book of Daniel, and hopefully this will be a great study for you as we do this. If you get the outlines, keep them together. And when we're done, we'll just have a short little booklet on the book of Daniel. Now, here's a direction we're going to go. Today's going to be introduction. And there are 13 weeks in this quarter, Lord willing. And so there are 12 chapters in the book of Daniel. So we're going to do a chapter a week. So for next week, I want you to read chapter 1 ahead of time. And if you've got your outlines, you'll notice at the bottom of page 2, there are 3 questions. And answer those ahead of time to the best of your ability. And we'll kind of go through those questions and give you some things to think about as we were to get, if we could be together that way. So let's talk about the book of Daniel. Let's first of all talk about the big picture. Why study Daniel? And of course, the first answer is it's the book of the Bible, and God wants us to know this. God put these books together for our understanding, to know His will, to see how life is, and that's important for us. But on our outline, we have 3 points I really want you to notice. Number 1, Daniel shows us how to live godly in an ungodly world. And that's where we are today. The message of this old book, very relevant today. Daniel was a godly man. He was a man of faith. Ezekiel, who's a contemporary, will refer to Daniel. In fact, when Ezekiel talks about righteous people, he names 3 of them. 2 of them from the book of Genesis. He talks about Noah and Job, and then he talks about one in the present tense, and that was Daniel. Daniel was listed with Noah and Job as righteous people. And so what we're going to learn as we walk through the book of Daniel is here's a righteous man living in an ungodly country among ungodly people, and how we see he acts, how he behaves, and that helps us. Number 2, Daniel was under pressure to conform. From the very first pages, he's being changed to becoming a Babylonian. He fights that. You and I are being forced to change to become secular in this world today. We must fight that. And again, through this book, we see great encouragement and help along that line. And then thirdly, from Daniel's perspective, from the world's perspective, it looked like the world was winning. It looked like the Babylonians were in charge. And it looked like the Babylonians were undefeatable. And there are times when we look in our secular world today and we begin to wonder, where is God? It looks like God's people are being defeated. It looks like Satan is winning. But through all this are some great, great lessons that we need to see and appreciate. That's why we're studying this. This is more than just a historical book. It's more than just, okay, it's a book of the Bible. We need to know books of the Bible. But it's relevant to our times. It's right where you live. It's right what you're going through. And as we go through this book, put yourself in the sandals of Daniel. See what he's going through. And you'll see a lot of parallels to what we're going through today. And that's what makes this such a great study for us. Well, on your outline here over here on the right-hand side, the background. The setting is Babylon. Now, if you went through Jason's class in Ezekiel, the setting was Babylon. And we'll talk about those books in just a moment. But this is what the story is all about. The people of Israel, which is now Judah. Judah has been taken into captivity for 70 years. God has punished them because of their wickedness, their idolatry, and their faithfulness. They've not been faithful to God. They've been unfaithful to God. And so through the prophet Jeremiah, God said, you're going to go into captivity. For 70 years, they would go into that captivity. In the process of doing this, God used Babylon as the instrument to do this. And Babylon would come into Jerusalem, and we'll see in just a moment that they would sack the city, they would rob the temple, they would burn the temple to the ground, they would kill the people or take the people captive. And then the book of Daniel begins. And so it's not good times. It's written under a cloud of gloom and doom. And those are some things we see. Now, let's begin by looking at some historical background passages. And we want to begin in the little book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk Chapter 1. Again, just written just a short time right before the book of Daniel. And in Habakkuk Chapter 1, Habakkuk asks God a question. He says in verse 2, I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yet destruction and violence are before me, strife exists and contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored, justice is never upheld, for the wicked surround the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. He's talking not about a foreign country there, he's talking about his people. He's talking about God's people. God's people weren't living right. They were oppressing each other. They were abusing each other. And what the prophet says is, why don't you do something, God? This is terrible. Now, starting with verse 5 of Habakkuk 1, God speaks. Look among the nations. Observe. Be astonished. Wonder. Because I am doing something in your days. You would not believe it if you were told. For behold, I'm rising up the Chaldeans. That's the Babylonians. The Babylonians were called Chaldeans. I'm rising up the Chaldeans. Now listen to how God describes them. That fierce and impetuous people who march through the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate within themselves. Their horses are swifter than lepers and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping down to devour. All of them come for violence. Their horde of faces moves forward. They collect captives like sand. They mock at kings, and rulers are a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap rubble to capture it. They will sweep through like this wind and pass on, but they will be held guilty, those whose strength is their God. And so what he's describing here is this is the instrument. God's using a foreign nation to punish his people. And God had made promises all the way back to Abraham, back in the book of Genesis, that through his seed, all the descendants of the earth would be blessed. God's going to keep that promise. Unlike Israel, who went away to Syria and just obliterated, they never became a nation again, Judah will come back. This is just a temporary punishment. This is for a generation, 70 years, and then they're going to come back. And after that 70 years, then we'll see the coming of the Messiah after those things. So when you go to the book of Daniel and chapter 1, let's just turn over there briefly, and then we'll look at some more things here in just a minute. Daniel chapter 1, I want you to notice the first chapter really is kind of the overall outline. A lot of books of the Bible are like that. They kind of give us a brief synopsis of what's going to take place, and then the details come later. So in Daniel chapter 1, in verse 1, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. When you go down to verse 21, the last verse of chapter 1, and Daniel continued into the 1st year of Cyrus the king. Cyrus was of the Medes and the Persians. So after the 70 years, the Medes and the Persians take over, and the people of Judah are allowed to come back. And so what we find in this first chapter is it's showing us this is the time period that Daniel's going to cover. He's going to cover those 70 years. Now, side point here, and you'll see this in that yellow star box there near the bottom of your outline. You know, so often when you think about Daniel and the lion's den, we use him for VBS. He's a teenager, and we talk about lessons of courage and faith and great stuff there. But Daniel probably is an old man. Daniel chapter 6 takes place not during the Babylonian time period, but during the time period of the Medes and the Persians. And so Daniel is easily mid-80s or in his 90s by the time we get to Daniel and Lion's Den. And that's something that I think is important to look at. So back on the outline here, there were 3 ways. So when Babylonians came, they came with full force, and they surrounded Jerusalem. And armies oftentimes did that and just sat there for a while. Sometimes they sat there for a long period of time. And rather than wasting their own troops, they just kind of wait out the others. And so in the year 605, the first wave of captives were taken to Babylon. This is where Daniel was taken. So when again, back in Daniel chapter 1, and we'll be covering this in detail next week, but it says there that the king ordered, verse 3, his chief official to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family, the nobles, youths in who there was no defect. They were good looking, shown intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning. So that's the first wave. Babylonians are outside the city. The city still exists, but they've gone in enough to capture a lot of the people. And they've handpicked who they wanted. And they picked out the cream of the crop, we might say. The varsity team, we could say. And they bring them back to Babylon. That's where Daniel's at. That's where this book begins. And next week we'll talk about what the Babylonians do to them at that time. A few years later, on your outline, 597, this is when the majority of the captives were taken. That's when Ezekiel was taken. And Ezekiel is a contemporary of this time. Now, again, just another biblical reference here. Over in the book of 2 Kings, if you will. 2 Kings chapter 24. And let's look at verse 13. 2 Kings 24, verse 13. It says, he carried out from there all the treasure of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king's house, cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon the king of Israel had made in the temple of the Lord, just as the Lord had said. Then he led away into exile all Jerusalem, all the captains, all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives and craftsmen and the smiths. None remain except the poorest of the land. Verse 15, the king, his mother, his wives are all taken captive. Now, there's 2 things I want you to notice here. First of all, we have nothing in history to compare to this. We cannot imagine the United States being invaded, let's say by China, and hundreds of thousands of our young people are taken to China. and the White House is invaded, and the president is captured, and he's taken to China, and the Chinese Navy is outside our borders, and the military is outside our country, and it looks like it's gloom, and it looks like it's hopeless. That's the situation facing Judah. Secondly, what's more important than this is that Jerusalem, since the days of David, was a city of God. It was Zion. It was where the temple was that Solomon built. It's where God's presence was. And what we're going to see is that was allowed to be destroyed. It's as if God is leaving Judah. That's a powerful thought for those people. So in the book of 2 Chronicles, if you will, 2 Chronicles chapter 36. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, and let's begin verse 15. 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 15. And it says, the Lord, the God of the fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers. And his messengers would be the prophets, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of God arose against his people, until there was no remedy. This is the cause. This is the reason why they're being punished. It wasn't God's fault. It was the people's fault. God tried to save them, but they wouldn't be saved. Therefore, he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men with a sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on the young man or virgin or old man or infirm. He gave them all aside into his hand, all the articles of the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king and of his officers. He brought them all to Babylon. That would include the Ark of the Covenant. That include going into the Holy of Holies. Not only a Jew, not only a non-Levite, not only not a high priest, but a pagan. Pagan going through those curtains, carrying out the Ark of the Covenant. That all the gold that Solomon had built around that temple, all that ripped off, the thing burned down, hundreds and hundreds of people in the streets dead. Others carried away into captivity. It's the darkest day in Judah's history. Then, verse 19, they burned the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its fortified buildings with fire, and destroyed all its valuable articles. Those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, and there they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the Persians. This was to fulfill the word spoken by Jeremiah. And so that is the setting. Now, one other background passage I want you to notice takes us to the book of Psalms, if you will. Psalms 137, written from Babylon. Psalms 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. When we remembered Zion, upon the willows in the midst of it, we hung our harps. For there our captors demanded of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget her skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to the very foundation. O daughter of Babylon, you devastated one, how blessed will be the one who repays you with recompense with which you have repaid us. How blessed will be the one who seizes and dashes your little ones against the rocks. Sing us a song. We can't. We're in a foreign land, and we don't like these things. And so that's the backdrop of what's taking place here. And so when you go over to the left-hand side here, we see three blue boxes. This is such a powerful point that God was punishing the people he promised. God was removing the temple. God was ending life in Jerusalem for a period of time. That God sent three major prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, to write words during this time period. Now, you see in these boxes here the time periods of these prophets. Jeremiah remained in Jerusalem. The poorest of the people stayed there. There were no walls. There was no temple. It was basically a bombed out city, we might say. And how the people were just trying to get on with life. And so Jeremiah, from that standpoint. Ezekiel is in Babylon. And he's writing to the people. And he's trying to help the exiles and encourage them and remind them to be faithful to God. Daniel, our book, also written from Babylon, but he's not writing to the people of God. He's with kings and nobles, and he's going to be addressing kings and nobles. And so what we have is these three perspectives. What's going on in Jerusalem after the captivity? And after all the captives have been taken away, what's going on in Jerusalem? That's Jeremiah. What's the people like in Babylon? That's Ezekiel. What's going on with the hierarchy of Babylon? What's going on with all the kings? That's Daniel. And Daniel's addressing them, trying to deal with those things. As you notice here on the outline, the book of Daniel refers to Jeremiah. And again, they were contemporaries at this time period. Now, point B here on the outline, the book of Daniel covers the Babylonian captivity. That's the first 5 chapters. And the Medo-Persian reign, the beginning of that reign, and that's the rest of the book. Daniel has very little contact with the people of God. We don't read about him. He's not preaching reform like Ezekiel does. He's not rebuking the people like Jeremiah does. He's dealing with the hierarchy of pagans. And he's dealing with Nebuchadnezzar. And so this is the message about that. And what we see here is, although the people of God were defeated, God wasn't defeated. And what Daniel is trying to show these pagan kings is that you are an instrument of God. There is one sovereign ruler, and that's Jehovah. And Jehovah is going to do to you whatever he wants. Don't think you're the most powerful person on the planet, because God is. And that's the message that comes through the book of Daniel. Point 3 on the outline, when you look in the Jewish Bible is broken down into 3 sections. The Torah, which is the law, the prophets, and the writings. And what's interesting is the book of Daniel is included in the writings, not the prophets. And the thought is because so much of this is historical. The first half of the book is historical stuff. And that's why it is believed that that's why the Jews classified it in that way. Jesus in Matthew 24 and verse 15 referred to Daniel as the prophet. And that's what we see. And so there are several miracles in the book of Daniel. We remember the fiery furnace and how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was saved. We remember the lion's den and how God protected Daniel there. There's multiple dreams and visions. And there's that time that God made Nebuchadnezzar eat grass like an ox for a whole season. And somehow he stayed alive. So those are just some background things we see. Then one final thing before we flip the page here. It's interesting how, we miss this in our English Bibles, how the language is. Daniel chapter 1 through first part of verse 4 of chapter 2 is written in Hebrew, the language of Judah. But from the second part of verse 4 all the way through chapter 7, it's written Aramaic. That's the language that Babylon spoke. But then from chapter 8 to the end of the book, it goes back to Hebrew. It's like, here's for the Hebrew people, here's a message for Babylon, here's a message for the Hebrew people. This book, although it deals with the kings of Babylon, is for God's people. This book was a message. It was a reminder that God is sovereign and they were not defeated. All this was according to God's plan. And then as we turn the page, there's great hope in the book of Daniel. It's one of the most encouraging books. It talks about the future of the kingdom, God's kingdom. He even gives us the timetable when the Messiah and the kingdom would be established. There's that great hope that God will reign over all the nations and God's promise to deliver his people. And through Daniel, we see a great man of faith. Multiple prayers in the book of Daniel. Daniel confessing his sins, confessing the sins of the nation, and God recognizes those things. We also notice over here on page 2 there are some great names that we're introduced to. Gabriel and Michael. We remember those in the book of Revelation. Archangels. Here in the book of Daniel, they're called Prince. And they both speak to Daniel. The Ancient of Days, which I think is a reference to Jesus, also is referred to. So those are unusual terms, things we don't find in a lot of books of the Bible, and they're listed there. Well, let's talk about the history. And as I said in one of our podcasts the other day, history is like going to the dentist. Some love it and some hate it. And for some, history is just dry as dirt and boring time. But unless you grasp what's going on, it's like opening up any book and you jump in the middle, or you sit down to watch a movie and what's going on? Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? You don't know what's going on. And so a little bit of history. And so this comes from this book, from this box here on page 2. Nebuchadnezzar was an Assyrian. He was an Assyrian chief. And he rose up after the death of one of the last Assyrian kings. And he broke away from the Assyrians in 626 and established Babylon as an independent nation. And they actually went and captured Assyria in 612. And that began the expansion of the Babylonian kingdom. During this time period, the last king of Judah that was good was Josiah. And Josiah was killed by the Egyptians in the year 609, and there's the biblical reference there. His son reigns for 3 months, and the Egyptian Pharaoh came and took him and put him in prison and made his brother the king. And this covers us through the beginning of the Babylonian time period. The siege took place in the 3rd year, or the year 605 of Jehoahaz's reign. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar dies. His son, Nebuchadnezzar. That's the key name. I think God had a place for Nebuchadnezzar. There's a lot of things God does with Nebuchadnezzar. He doesn't treat him like other foreign kings. I think God saw some hope in Nebuchadnezzar, and we'll bring that out as we kind of go through some of these lessons here. And so Jehoiakim dies in the year 598, according to your outline. His son Coniah reigns for 3 months. This is during the captivity, and he's taken away to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar appoints his uncle Zedekiah to become the king over the Judean province. Babylon is going to be the nation, but he's going to allow a Jewish man to take care of the Jews, kind of similar to what Rome did. And he decides to rebel against Babylon, which you should never do. And because of that, the city is destroyed. He too is taken away in captivity, and Babylon just reigns. After that, there's no Judean kings, not for a long, long time. And it really is going to be the end of such things. And it's in that backdrop that the book of Daniel is going to be written. So we have political turmoil. We have a great king dying, his son taken over, and then his son being disposed, and then a foreign nation putting who they want to be king. Again, go back to my analogy of China. China has come in and killed a lot of us, taken a lot of us captive, and they've taken our president captive. They put in a puppet to reign this nation, but this puppet is responsible to China. Well, in the process of all that, that puppet rises up and says, I'm tired of you, China. I'm not going to do what you say. So China just comes in and just wipes us out, basically. They just come in with full force and takes that puppet guy and takes him back in captivity and puts up the Chinese flag, and this is going to be China. Okay? That's what's going on. But the difference is, this is all under the fingers of God. This is done on intention. Everything was on a timetable. God was only going to allow it to be so long, and that God was going to turn things. And it's behind all that that this powerful, powerful book of Daniel is written. So stay with us. Read chapter 1 for next week and answer those 3 questions. And we're going to just dive in. And I hope this will be helpful for you. Thank you so much. We miss you. We love you. And we hope you have a great, great day. Thank you so much.